Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute to let people come into the webinar. But in the meantime, if you want to tell us where you're coming from, we'd love to hear it. You can drop that in the chat. All right, let us begin. Welcome back, everyone, to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I'm a doctoral candidate in English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director of Jane Austen and Company. We are delighted to see everyone here for what is, for us on the East Coast of the United States, a noontime talk, although I feel like we're getting people from all over the world today. And this is yet another event in our series, Asia and the Regency. Today, we welcome Dr. Alexandra Loske to talk about a walk through an enchanted Regency palace, Chinese export ware in the Royal Pavilion. Dr. Loske is graciously here on behalf of the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust, Brighton Hove. And we are delighted that she is here with us. For those of you joining us for the first time today, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our mission is to bring free events and workshops on Jane Austen and her broader global context to audiences around the world. Today, we are also joined by my co-host, Dr. Susan Allen Ford, as well as our technical director, Jared Powell. I'm going to hand things over to Susan now to introduce herself and Dr. Loske.
Hello, I'm Susan Allen Ford, and I'm a member of the Jane Austen Summer Program Board and editor of Persuasions and Persuasions Online, and I'm joining you today from London. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexandra Loske. Dr. Loske is a German-British art historian with a particular interest in late 18th and early 19th century European art and architecture. She read English and linguistics at Humboldt University, Berlin, and art history at the University of Sussex, Brighton, where she completed her PhD in 2014. The subject of her doctoral thesis was the use of color in the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Alexandra has curated many temporary fine art exhibitions and permanent displays, among them Regency Color and Beyond, 1785 to 1845 in 2014 at the Royal Pavilion, followed in 2015 by Exotic Creatures, which focused on the depiction of non-native animals in the Georgian Age. She's been involved with the exhibition Turner et la Couleur in Aix-en-Provence, France, and the Turner Contemporary in Margate. And she's curated two exhibitions at the Royal Pavilion and Brighton Museum in 2017, Visions of the Royal Pavilion Estate and Jane Austen by the Sea. All the King's Horses in 2019 told the story of the magnificent royal stables in Brighton and George IV's fascination with all things equestrian. Her latest exhibition, Designing an Enchanted Palace, focuses on the royal decorators John and Frederick Crace and their original designs for the Royal Pavilion. Since 2016, Alexandra Loske has been the curator of the Royal Pavilion, Brighton, where she regularly gives talks, lectures, and specialist tours. She's pleased to announce that she's officially writing a new book on the interiors of the Royal Pavilion, which will be published by Yale University Press in 2024. But before we hear from Dr. Loske, we need a few words of instruction from Jared Powell, our technical director.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Let me share my screen really quickly for this little set of slides. Hopefully this little control bar isn't blocking it for you guys. I'm not sure how to move that, so sorry if that's in the way. So I'd like to take a moment to explain how today's event will work. The event will last about 90 minutes in total, including Q&A. So throughout and after the presentation, you're welcome to put questions for Dr. Loske in the Q&A box, which will be answered at the end. Susan and Anne will take turns asking them. If you would like to chat with other attendees, as you have already been doing, you would use the chat function. So questions for the speaker, Q&A, conversation with other attendees in the chat. And be sure when you're in the chat that you have the drop-down menu set to everyone, because it might default to hosts and panelists. Speaking of the chat, we often have a very robust chat at our events. And if you would like to hide that so the little notifications don't distract you, I've got some instructions to walk you through that. So if you're on PC, Windows PC, what you'll do first is click the chat icon, and it should pop up in a separate floating window there. And then you would just click along the top of the window and drag it off screen. If you are on Mac, it's a similar process. There's just one extra step. You click the chat, and usually it'll pop out as a sidebar. And so then you click your little drop-down menu there, and then choose pop out. And then again, click at the top of the box and drag off screen. And finally, if you're on mobile or on a tablet, you hit your chat icon just like with the rest, and then the notification bell there, and you should have a pop-up that says to mute. So if you would like to do that, those are the steps to walk you through. If you have other technical issues that pop up, feel free to call me out in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on it, and I'll help you guys out. And with that, I believe we're back to Anne.
Thank you, Jared. Please note that today's program will be recorded. We typically post these about a week after the original presentation, and we'll notify you all on our Facebook page and email listserv when it is available to view. And without further ado, Dr. Alexandra Loske.
Well, hello, and I hope you can all hear me, and I hope you can see the beginning of my presentation, of my walk through the enchanted Royal Pavilion. Thank you so much, Susan and Jared, for introducing this talk so beautifully. It's a huge honor being here with such a global audience, and I think that's probably the only good thing that has come out of COVID, that we can have these audiences, these global gatherings. I'd like to take you physically through the Royal Pavilion, my place of work, and here it is. Here is the outside in an image from the 1820s. But this is the next best thing. So for the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to show you mostly the interior, but also give you a bit of context how this extraordinary building was created, who was behind it, what influenced what is in it, and what has become of it, and crucially, what's been happening there in the last 2 to 3 years. So come with me on this journey through the Royal Pavilion. From Susan's wonderful introduction, you will have sort of understood why I've called it a walk through an enchanted Regency Palace, because that is the part of the title of a current little exhibition at Brighton Museum, which is next door to the Royal Pavilion, showing some original design drawings for the Royal Pavilion, which I'm going to show you a couple of during this talk. But we're going to concentrate on particular objects that are in the pavilion and that have recently returned to the pavilion. Most of them Asian export ware, but not all of them. So we're also going to see a lot of pure chinoiserie objects in this talk. So here's the outside, and you know, we have referred in the title to Chinese export ware. Now this doesn't look very Chinese, this looks Indian, but if you have a look at the inside, and here is just one. It's probably the most spectacular room in the building. This is the music room. Here you see the Chinese theme. Obviously not all of it is Chinese, but there is some Chinese export ware in here. But it's about the Gesamtkunstwerk of what was created with these, so starting with objects that had come all the way from China or Japan. But since this is with a few exceptions, as I've seen in the chat, not a Brighton or Sussex audience, let me just show you where the palace is. So for our sort of far away guests on this talk, this is where Brighton is and the Royal Pavilion. So you see here the United Kingdom, and I don't know whether you can see my pointer, hope you can. Brighton is here, literally on the edge of Britain, on the south coast of England, in the county of Sussex, actually on the edge of East and West Sussex. And it is, I'm biased, but I have to say it's one of the most beautiful areas of the United Kingdom. Here we have the famous chalk cliffs, which really creates, you know, the basis of our landscape. These are the Seven Sisters here, just to the east of Brighton. And as you can see, here is London. And Brighton is just in a straight line down from London, is the closest, or was the closest, seaside resort in the 18th century in England. And this is really, really important. Of course, in George IV's time, when the pavilion was built, there were no trains yet. He just missed the trains, but it was still, in terms of distance, the closest watering place, as they were called, from London. And this is quite crucial, because watering places were the height of fashion in the Georgian era. And here is a cartoon showing Brighton, the so-called mermaids at Brighton. This is what was going on. This is what attracted people to the seaside all around the British Isles. But Brighton, a particularly fashionable so-called watering place or seaside resort, where people who had that sort of money, who could afford to do so, would go and take the waters, i.e. use the seawater as a sort of medicinal cure, but also as a place to sort of to get away to. So this is a Georgian caricature of which you will see more. And I can't help thinking that our George, creator of the Royal Pavilion, was partly sort of inspired by or drawn to Brighton by the prospect of taking the waters alongside those drenched ladies. Now, and this was also the reason why a few years ago we put on this little exhibition on Jane Austen called Jane Austen by the Sea. So this happened in the Royal Pavilion, and of course, as you will know, there is absolutely no proof that Jane Austen ever came to Brighton, but she knew about Brighton partly through her brother, and she references it in some of her works. So we thought that was a good enough reason to put on a little exhibition. Coincided with the 200th anniversary of the publication of Emma, and it was a rather lovely thing to do. So here again we have a contemporary map. Here is London, and then straight down here is Brighton. Brighton could be reached by horse-drawn coach in 4 hours in the late 18th and early 19th century. So this is one of the reasons why not just rich and famous people in the aristocracy came to Brighton, but also eventually this man. And this man is the person who really created the Royal Pavilion. It's a rare example of a building or a royal residence that was created almost entirely from the mind and the imagination of one person. This is George IV. He was only king for 10 years, from 1820 to 1830, but we also know him. And in fact, we know an entire period in art and culture, has been named after him, the Regency. So we also know him as the Prince Regent. So a regency was declared in 1811 because his father, King George III, had become unfit to rule. He had been suffering from bouts of illness, possible mental illness or porphyria. And his eldest son, George, became the regent. And this was an extraordinarily difficult time for Europe, for England, because of the Napoleonic Wars raging, but it was also for our George an incredibly eventful time, because Napoleon was defeated in 1815, and that made him, George the Regent, quite by accident, the most powerful man in Europe. He was also, of course, the Prince of Wales, and he became the Prince of Wales within a few weeks after his birth in 1762. And crucially, he was at the pavilion, and I say at so loosely, in all three phases of his life, as Prince of Wales, as Prince Regent, and as King. So on the left here, you see him as the very young, very dashing Prince of Wales. In the middle here, the famous coronation portrait. And I should say that both the portraits on the left are commissioned portraits. There are also many, many, many exciting, titillating portraits of him created by those Georgian cartoonists. So here, the famous one by James Gilray, where George is depicted as, a man of abundance, shall we say, of enjoying life and overindulging in many, many things. So it's important to have these two images of him, really, when we talk of him, how he wanted to be seen, how he saw himself, and how he was caricatured at the time as well. So a man who was undoubtedly vain, undoubtedly living in a bubble, a man, but he was also incredibly charming and very generous, but also a spendthrift. So he was a man of many contradictions, but in his greatest defense, I would have to say, he goes down in royal history in England as the greatest patron of the art and collector, with possibly only the exception of Charles I. And this was recognized because we're having all these sort of anniversaries here at the moment, 200th anniversary of George becoming king and the coronation and so on, just been also swept up in the pandemic, of course. This was recognized in the two most recent exhibitions at the Queen's Gallery at Buckingham Palace. So there was, just before lockdowns started, we had George IV Art and Spectacle, with which I was involved with a small essay in the book, and which really celebrated him as a great, great collector and patron and visionary mind, really. And even the next one called Masterpieces, where they brought in the best paintings from Buckingham Palace into the gallery next door for people to see them close up. The majority of those paintings, the best paintings in the royal collection, were acquired by George IV. And I'm showing you here just two examples, the two fantastic Rembrandts, Agatha Bassia, probably the most beautiful painting in the royal collection, in my mind. And on the left here, the shipbuilder and his wife. And I'm saying this as a sort of preamble because I want you to get a real sense of what George was interested in. So these are just paintings. He was also a builder king who completely reconfigured Buckingham Palace itself, who greatly reconfigured the inside and the outside of Windsor Castle and many other buildings, who loved bling, loved by which I mean sort of silver gilt, who collected Sèvres porcelain, very, very colorful, furniture, weaponry, anything you can think of. The largest part of the royal collection as it stands today, we owe to George IV. So this painting here, The Shipbuilder and His Wife by Rembrandt, he hung in his London palace. And this is a building that sadly no longer survives, but it matters for this particular talk. This is Carlton House. Carlton House was sort of overlooking St. James's Park in London. And you can see how the young George plays or indulges in his interest in interior decoration and collecting, of course. And here we have that famous Rembrandt painting hanging in the Blue Velvet Room in Carlton House. Carlton House was demolished in the 1820s, and it may be linked to the Royal Pavilion in some way, this demolition. So Carlton House, here we have it. That's a now lost building, although the Capitol survived at the National Gallery in London. And here, this gives you a rough idea where it was. Here is St. James's Palace, and here's St. James's, St. James's Park, and here's St. James's Palace. So, and crucially, in this first palace of his own, his London residence, he had a Chinese room or Chinoiserie room. And this is the only one of two pictures that we have of this room. So this room was there by the 1780s, and it had Shinrasari cabinets, it had sort of lovely sort of Chinese figures, it had candelabra, Chinoiserie candelabra, and sort of Chinese inspired panels here. And keep this a little bit in your mind, because you'll see these images again. But it's interesting to see that he plays with this theme first in his very first own palace in London. So at Carlton House, he engaged the architect Henry Holland, and Henry Holland gets engaged again down in Brighton. And George comes to Brighton with the excuse of having to take the waters to, it's for its health, of course, but I think it was a great getaway place for him, where he could, well, a playground away from London, where he could sort of play with ideas and just be away from the strict London court life. But the first building he creates there, once he decides he wants to spend more time there, is this. This is the Royal Pavilion, then called the Marine Pavilion, in this chaste, elegant, neoclassical style designed by Henry Holland. A symmetrical building with two wings and central saloon, a circular room with a flat neoclassical dome. So from here, he goes to this over a period of 40 years. So basically all his adult life, he sort of is engaged in expanding his holiday palace by the sea. And this, of course, this Indian inspired exterior is by the great John Nash, who gets his hands on this palace in 1815. Note, just after Napoleon has been defeated. But we want to concentrate on the interior. So the exterior is clearly influenced by images of India that were available at the time, coming from, for example, uncle and nephew Williams, Daniels, who had been to India and were returning with these images of India. But let's look at the inside. Well, he fills the inside from 1802 onwards, after the neoclassical phase, with export ware from Asia, brought here by the East India companies, of course, acquired sometimes through middlemen, sometimes through his decorators, and he fills it with chinoiserie as well. And this is noted, and this is caricatured. So here's another of those great Georgian cartoons, and it shows him wanting more baubles for his Chinese temple, and it's absolutely clear that by Chinese temple they mean the Royal Pavilion, because here it is on the wall. He is inspired in this, of course, not just by the global fashion for chinoiserie, but also directly. This is what he sees as a little boy. He grows up at Kew, just west of London, and he sees the Chinese pagoda and other buildings in what's called the wilderness. And these are these sort of little fun structures right at the end of the park. And they come from a generation earlier, of course. And this one designed by a man who had actually been to China, William Chambers. So this is what young George sees on the outside. But even inside the palaces, the residences, he sees Asian export wear, Chinese export wear. Here is little George, and this is him dressed up as a Roman soldier, with his brother Frederick also dressed up, and his mother, Queen Charlotte. And this is in Buckingham House, now Buckingham Palace. And look carefully what is in the background. So this is his mother's sort of room. This is her world. This is what she has created and assembled, not just colorful sort of Middle Eastern carpets, but also these Chinese figures, and these are called nodders, and they are pure export wear made for the export market. And I can just imagine little George playing with these, and they're called nodders because they do nod, they move, their heads move, sometimes the arms move as well, and they're made of unfired clay, hugely sort of, you know, evocative of another world, another sort of another court life, really. They sort of depict Chinese court officials, and you don't find them in China themselves. They're made in China, but for the export market. And these are very, very similar, although we can't pin them down exactly, to the ones that he put into the Royal Pavilion. So this is one currently on loan from Her Majesty to us. Possibly this, but this is where the inspiration came from his mother, and from his sisters as well. So here we have those Chinese figures in the long gallery of the Royal Pavilion. So I'm just zooming in here so you can see them. And he had the largest collection anywhere in this country of these Chinese nodders. And I think at one point there were 39 in the building. We currently have 12 in the building. They are fantastic objects, really. This is another thing that his mother gave him, and these are beautiful Chinese vases, quite unusual. They have a lacquer, so it's wonderful Chinese porcelain already, and then the Chinese porcelain is covered in lacquer and mother of pearl, so it's of lacquered porcelain. And these vases were given from mother to son. We don't know exactly when, but we'd like to think this is a sort of trigger. And he sort of, you know, creates this passion. They sort of trigger the passion for Chinese objects. We don't know who mounted them. They are clearly English mounts, so they could have been mounted by his mother or by George himself. But they are crucial objects in his life, we think. And I mentioned the sisters, not to be dismissed, that his sisters who spent so much of their time at Frogmore House in the grounds of Windsor Great Park, where they were creative, and the Chinoiserie style was quite often associated with women. Certainly when we think about sort of interior spaces, but of course George turns this on its head, this association with women. And here they are. These are his three sisters. And I'm pleased to say that this is a little display that was in that George IV Art and Spectacle exhibition at Queen's Gallery, which acknowledged their input, because this is what they did at Frogmore. They created chinoiserie interiors, cabinets. There were 3 in total. 2 are shown in Pine's royal residences, some using real Chinese lacquer, again, so export wear, some imitating lacquer, and the princesses themselves created these sort of lacquer imitations. And some of these objects here, not quite export wear, but possibly gifts from the emperor, the Chinese emperor, given to Lord Macartney at the 1792 expedition. So this is what the sisters do. They create these female spaces, these quite small enclosed spaces with a Chinese theme, very intense coloring. What does their brother do? He's the future King of England. He does it on this scale. So this is the music room of the Royal Pavilion, where the walls are so high. This is such a big room. You can't possibly do this in lacquer. So he creates, or he commissions huge canvas coverings for the walls. They're basically paintings that imitate lacquer. And this is what's in the background here. This is my sort of zoom background. A painting that's trying to look like Chinese lacquer. So what happened to all these amazing things in the pavilion? And you'll see many more of them in a minute. Well, George dies in 1830. His brother William uses the pavilion, King William IV, but he only lives for 7 years. And then their niece becomes queen. This is Queen Victoria, and here we see her arriving at the Royal Pavilion. But she did not like the site. She quite liked the interior, and her future husband Albert really likes the interiors. But they both think that Brighton is not right for them, the pavilion is not right for them, and they sell the Royal Pavilion in 1850. And they, at the same time, shortly before, they have built this huge new wing at Buckingham Palace, the East Wing, which you see here. And this needs to be filled somehow with things. It needs to be furnished. So they empty the Royal Pavilion completely between in the second half of the 1840s. And many, many objects get reused and reinterpreted in the Blue Wing of Buckingham Palace, including all the mounted porcelain, everything, all the fireplaces, almost all the fireplaces, all the chandeliers, everything left the building. And the council, or the town commissioners of Brighton, who bought the pavilion for very little money, one should say, had bought an empty shell of a building. And this is what Albert and Victoria did. And I think that is interesting too. So this is one room in 1850 in Buckingham Palace, which looks like the Royal Pavilion, but it's not. But it's filled with things from the Royal Pavilion. This is another one at the other end of the wing, and we'll come to that again in a minute, filled with things from the Royal Pavilion. So we entered a period of what Clifford Musgrave, a director at the pavilion in the 20th century, called municipal nakedness. So the building was empty, but as you can see here in this early 20th century image, many things were returned. Many large items were returned by Queen Victoria within a couple of decades. The large chandeliers came back, and this has been happening. This has been a constant, it's been an ongoing relationship that we have with the royal family and with the royal collection of loans, either permanent or temporary, or outright returns and gifts. So it wasn't all bad. Whoops. And just before, in 2018, we finished this project, the complete restoration of that central circular room, the Saloon, to its last complete phase from 1823. Less chinoiserie, more regal, but still with a lot of sort of Chinese influences. And when this was finished, Her Majesty the Queen gave us this object on permanent loan. This is, well, George turned it into a potpourri holder. Of course, it started life as a Chinese bowl, and this is it. Hope you can see my cursor. This celadon bowl is the only thing Chinese in this object. Everything else is European. Even the lid, which copies the porcelain, that's a painted copper, and then of course these wonderful mounts here, all to the design of Robert Jones. So taken out of its context completely to fit into this complete design scheme of the Saloon. So that was wonderful. That was 2018. And I thought as a curator, it can't get much better. And then we got a call from the Royal Collection saying offering us the loan of more than 100 amazing original objects, original to the pavilion, I should say. And this happened for a reason. So this was called a Princess Treasure. And alongside this, we prepared this smaller, much smaller exhibition on the crisis. How all these big designs have started off in tiny drawings and so on. So this was happening in 2019, 2020. And it happened because the new wing that Queen Victoria had built in the 1840s was about to undergo complete and utter restoration and was going to be completely emptied. So, and the Royal Collection called it the decanting of the East Wing. So all of these objects that were originally removed from the Royal Pavilion in the 1840s were offered, almost all of them were offered to us on temporary loan. And of course we said yes. And I'm just going to show you in a few examples now of how what was so amazing about this, because I've dropped in quite a few of these 1820s images from John Nash's views of the Royal Pavilion, these wonderful aquatints. And you look at these aquatints and you think, yeah, this is great. This shows us the building in the 1820s. Isn't this wonderful? But nothing prepares you for putting the original objects back into their original place. So if you just look at this saloon image, and I'd like you to first look at these vases here, which in the aquatint look greenish. This is what they looked like when we put them into place. And again, Chinese high-end ceramics, especially the monochromes, really, really expensive already. And then here in Europe, they get mounted, they get framed, they get sort of, set like jewels into a setting of gilt bronze, either in France or here in England. And nothing prepares you for the effect of this, seeing them in their original place. So, and now I'd like you to look at the fireplace. And I know you've used this as the sort of key image for this talk. This really explains George's vision and George's style. So we have here as a garniture complete for this exhibition what George wanted there. And what do we have? We have 2 candelabra, a pair, and we have this incredible concoction in the center here called the Kylin Clock. And again, for me as a visual historian and art historian, it's wonderful seeing it all sort of slot in together and fit in. And it meant I could learn about how the building worked, how the interiors were assembled. So if we just look at the candelabra first here on the left, of course, as before, I'm just going to go back quickly just to show you where the Chinese bit is. This is a Chinese vase. Everything else was added by European designers and craftspeople to the design of Robert Jones. So even this, basically doubling the height of this vase, is this copper copy imitating the porcelain. But what it showed me is it made me understand one of the designer's styles a lot better, because I could get close up to these tiny figures that Robert Jones created. Pure chinoiserie, of course, pure chinoiserie. But this object, the Kylin Clock, and I'm showing you on the right here, the official photograph from the Royal Collection website. Let me just unpick this for you. You wanted to hear about export ware. Well, this starts life. Well, where does it start life? In the center here, the actual clock is a part of a 17th century Chinese vase, turned on its side, cut into pieces, turned on its side, turned into a clock. It is flanked by 2 Chinese lions referred to as Kylin. So these are Buddhistic lions. On top of this sits a 17th century Japanese figure group. This is Japanese porcelain. Then they sit on this base of a broken up Chinese bowl or something, of course, all mounted in gilt bronze in France. So this is how it comes from France, with this elaborate gilt bronze setting, already a concoction. And it arrives here. It's bought for George in 1820. He wants to put it in the saloon. What does he do? Well, he adds another layer, and he adds another layer, which is not in this picture, but it's you can just about see it here on the left-hand side, by Westmacott, to lift it, of course, but also to link it to the furniture in the room. And that is not enough. He then adds more gilt bronze mounts by Samuel Parker. And these pick up, they make the object even bigger, and they pick up on motifs in the room, for example, the sunflower. So this is an incredible export. Well, it's more than export ware. It is pure, it becomes something else, and it becomes an integral part in this room, of course. Fantastic object. And for me, also going back to the smaller things, seeing these objects in that room, and then looking at the Craces drawings for the Royal Pavilion design. So the Craces were, you know, father and son, two of the principal designers of the interiors, and we have their drawings. And just picking out on one motif, the bat, for example, I suddenly found that bat from the Crace drawing on one of these vases. So you can see how the pavilion was created down to the minutest detail. So, just another example why this was such an extraordinary loan. If we go back to Carlton House and the beginning of George's interest in creating Chinoiserie rooms, here we have that room. Look at this cabinet. This is a European Chinoiserie cabinet by Adam Weisweiler, which survives, as do the wonderful French Chinoiserie candelabra. So he acquired them for Carlton House. He then copied the pair of cabinets, had sort of English copies made to have 4 in order to move them to the Royal Pavilion. They ended up, after Victoria removed them, in various parts of Buckingham Palace. So you can see them here on the side here next to the fireplace. And also, I hope by now you also notice these candelabra here. So things move around, things get used and reinterpreted, and that is fine. But we're very pleased to have eventually all 4 Weisweiler cabinets and the candelabra back in the Royal Pavilion. So this is the music room gallery, and here you see these objects. And what made this especially moving is that, so here's one of the Weisweiler tables. And this is how we installed it. Wherever possible, we put things where they were in the Nash Views images. Here are those vases that possibly started George's passion for Chinese art and chinoiserie given to him by his mother. It's very, very moving having these in the building in that particular place. But this is just an example how things move around and how you suddenly understand how he moved along with this through his life and how he developed his style. So to come to the music room, you've seen this once a couple of times before, perhaps the most recognizable room in the Royal Pavilion. And here is again the aquatin from the 1820s. And it's fine, it's a spectacular image. But I'd like you to look at the objects in this room. And here we have, of course, the fabulous, towering porcelain pagodas or Chinese towers. They are on the left and they are on the right-hand side of this image. But really, this aquatin doesn't do them justice, because here they are in the Royal Pavilion, back in the place they were sort of designed for, because of course they were export ware. These came from China, made for the export market, but again, only a part of them remains Chinese. And it's actually it starts from about here, and then it's up to about here, that is Chinese, and they come in bits, in sort of, they're sort of stacked together. And George, of course, to make them fit into the room and to make them sort of, speak to the room, he adds these huge plinths, and this is of course English porcelain, and then he adds a further plinth in sort of imitation marble, and then he adds finials with sort of fish and dragon motifs. And of course, the porcelain bells and little dogs that hang from them are not good enough. It has to be gilt bronze. So they get embellished, and he spends a lot more time embellishing them than actually purchasing the Chinese porcelain in the first place. So here we have that image of the pagodas in situ, and as compared to the Nash view. And this was quite an amazing thing to watch, to see these being installed. We had 2 or 3 members of staff just working on assembling these pagodas when the loan came. And on the left here, you see the wonderful David Wheeler, who has conserved and repaired these pagodas. He had been doing this for the best part of 20 years, and seeing him assembling these, all of them, in the room they were meant for, was a very moving occasion. And he himself was moved, because he said, you know, I've never seen them in their right place, all of them together. So clearly the absolute stars of this exhibition. And here, and really images can't really capture what it meant for this room, for these pagodas to be there, how they sort of pull your view up, they pull your eyes up, and suddenly you get a bit dizzy because the ceiling sort of seems to spin. Everything goes upwards. And then on the other side, again, we look into the Nash view, and where the porcelain is just given us this sort of green color, it doesn't do it justice at all. Look at what's here. It's 2 smaller pagodas, it's 2 vases, it's a magnificent clock, and it's also porcelain uplighters. And here is the image of the lawns being installed. So we have this, this is complete. The 2 more Chinese pagodas, and these are actually Japanese vases, Arita vases, again mounted and turned into candelabra. And again, as a curator, it's wonderful to suddenly see that things make sense. You know, you see certain motifs on the vase, which are then also on the walls. And then sadly, of course, we had to shut the pavilion because the world shut down in March 2020. And this is the last picture I took before we had to completely lock down because of COVID. So not enough people saw this exhibition. It should have been seen by, hundreds and thousands of people. So sadly, this wasn't meant to be. But we got an extension to the loan, and all these objects left us in just this January gone. So I'd like to finish, though, with something that is not Chinese export ware, but that I think sums up George and the Royal Pavilion and perhaps the Regency and Shinrasari as a style. So allow me, I hope I'm not overrunning now, but I'd like to finish with these objects. And this is a clock on the left and a barometer with a thermometer on the right. And these are, and you can see here how they were described, how the clock was described in a very early account by someone coming to the Royal Pavilion in 1821. So these are objects designed specifically, not just for the Royal Pavilion, but by George. It's commissioned by George, designed for the Royal Pavilion for a particular spot in the Royal Pavilion, not just a room, but a particular spot. So these 2 objects were in the banqueting room, one at each end, on the fireplaces at the north and south wall. And they are pure chinoiserie. There is nothing Chinese in these. The designer was Robert Jones. The clock movement is by Voyami, and then there's several other makers and craftsmen involved in the silver gilt and the decorations. But the reason I'm showing you these is because if you want to understand George and interior decoration in that period, look at one object and see how it speaks to the rest of the room and the rest of the building. So they are amazing objects in their own right, but see what happens when they get slotted into the place they were designed for. So here is the clock, and this is soon after installation. And suddenly it was like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle, so slotting in. this is the clock in the banqueting room, and the pictures are taken sort of looking upwards to the mirror, which mirrors, of course, the ceiling of the banqueting room. So how does it speak to the room? Well, here we have sort of the wider angle view, and what you see here is these figures that speak in three-dimensional form to the ones in two-dimensional form on the walls. If you look at the colors, you know, the way they're placed, if you look at the colors, we have the deep blues, we have the deep reds, which we see in these, again, pretend lacquer sort of frames of the pictures. We have the blues, including the lapis lazuli in the printed Prussian blue wallpaper, but also in other objects, and down to the minutest detail, the combination of silver and gold, the sunflower motif, all of this suddenly makes sense. So here's just a little thing I've put together. The clock is here in the middle, and look how, you know, the chromatic details, the motifs, the gestures, the composition, how all that speaks, one object speaks to all the other objects in the room. So that for me was the high point of this exhibition. So I hope this has given you a sense of what the Royal Pavilion is like, what inspired George, how he used Chinese export ware, and how it was turned into something like, yeah, really a Gesamtkunstwerk in every room. I hope you'll get a chance to see the Royal Pavilion. It still looks magnificent because we still have a lot of permanent lawns and a lot of original surfaces and objects in the Royal Pavilion, and we have a lot of exciting things happening in the coming year or two. So thank you so much for listening. Come and see me at the Royal Pavilion.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating look into those collections, and just all of the different things that went into, you know, the original collecting and the restoration. It was just a fascinating view. Thank you. I'm going to start off the Q&A with a bit of a question about your background. And the wallpaper behind you, is that from the Royal Pavilion? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, you have just frozen a little bit, but I could.
Am I frozen?
Buffering a bit. Okay, I could. You were. Internet is unstable. It says. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
Yes.
now. You're unfrozen.
Good. Did you just ask me a question about what's in the background?
Yes, your
here?
background.
Okay, so I missed the middle bit, but just
Yes.
to explain, yeah, this is so my background is in color. I think Susan mentioned I was very lucky. I got this scholarship for PhD or DPhil research. So I was basically let loose on the Royal Pavilion interiors, and I looked into color theory and new pigments in the Georgian era, and how that had influenced the interiors of the Royal Pavilion. Of course, it's got a lot to do with the influence of Chinese arts, and but also what was available and what people could afford. So the colors you see behind me, they're highly saturated. Of course, one thing was to imitate lacquer. Fine, imitation was happening a lot in interior decoration. We have marbling, and I showed you a little bit of sort of fake marbling. Wood graining and so on. So how do you make a canvas look like lacquer? Well, you use extremely good pigments, and this behind me to create this glassy red effect is an opaque red called vermilion, and the crazers said that it was Chinese vermilion. I don't quite believe that. I think they meant the quality of Chinese vermilion. So that is a very dense a pigment, and of course George could afford to buy this in high quality and use it sort of you know, in its purest form. So not mixed with white or anything. So that's then opaque. And then how do you get the glassy effect? Well, you get another red. So this has a thin layer of a translucent, a transparent red. And this is an organic red called cochineal, which I can see you've put your lipstick on, I've put my lipstick on, used to be in a lot of makeup and a lot of food coloring. But it gives you an idea how expensive everything was that was used at the pavilion to create these effects. So, you know, of course, George could go for the highest saturation in color and the most expensive pigment to create his sort of pleasure palace by the sea.
Thank you.
There are some questions in the talk, I think, that sort of work together. They're interested in what I thought was fascinating, what you told us about how George's tastes were formed by and related to the tastes of his family, his mother, his sisters. And you talked about Frogmore and how his sisters would have been involved in creating some of the pieces even. One of the participants mentions that in Pride and Prejudice, the Bennet girls, when they're visiting their aunt, see in different imitations of china that they created on her mantelpiece. Is this the same kind of instinct for imitating Chinese chinoiserie or Chinese export? And what would these things have looked like, and how do they relate, or how are they different from what George and his sisters might have been doing?
Well, it's a huge question. So it concerns women. What can women do? What do women do? What do people in other classes do? But how far does it filter down? Of course, who can afford a piece of original Asian porcelain? Who can afford to mount it? We must never forget this is court style. This is a royal residence. This is a royal palace. And George himself was well aware of this. Of course, he had access to, you know, he didn't own the money, but he was spending the money, as we know. So this is court style, let us not forget. But it's really interesting, this notion that it is a feminine or female style associated with women, not entirely, but I can see why that is written about and talked about a lot, because you see a lot of women's spaces in this style. Of course, George comes and does it at the not the wrong time, but later than anyone else. And I think you've probably had talks in your series, commenting on this, how chinoiserie was really at its peak in the mid 18th century. So what's George doing in the early 1800s? Reviving it? Did he revive it? Possibly, but he certainly expresses it in a very masculine court style. And he does it with great aplomb, and it's a building that really sort of, you know, takes you on a sensual journey. But then, you know, how does that go beyond what women do? And then the other question there was, of course, what do people do? How do people imitate? Well, manufacturers imitate, and this is done on a huge scale, of course. And the classic example is, of course, porcelain. You know, the porcelain comes from China, and by the early 18th century, European manufacturers have cracked that secret and are imitating. So the first, of course, is Meissen, China, in I think 1720s. So they understand how it's made. So once you know how it's made, what do you then make? Of course, the very earliest pieces of porcelain here in Europe imitate Chinese porcelain. It makes sense, perhaps, of course. And then, of course, as time moves on, we have a lot of imitations that make it, of course, more affordable and cheaper. So, I mean, Delftware imitates, you know, Chinese porcelain, or the blue and white Chinese porcelain. There are other ways of imitating, of course. Lacquer is imitated, so it's called Japanning. You can do that, and of course not, real lacquer isn't used. It's usually, I think, papier-mâché, and it's still being done, of course. And what the princesses did is they did Japanning, I think, but they also rearranged the rooms, of course. Bamboo was imitated not by the princesses themselves, but by, again, European furniture makers. That's quite easy. You use pine wood, you carve it, and then you paint it. With sort of, glossy paint to make it look like bamboo, of which we have a lot in the pavilion, and not just bamboo imitated with pine wood, but also in metal. So we have these huge staircases. So do come and see the pavilion, really, at the north and the south end. And they look as light as a feather. They look as if, a heavy person could sort of fall through them. But of course, they're made of cast iron. They're made of cast iron, painted and shaped, or shaped and painted to look like bamboo. So it works on many, many levels. But I love this idea of imitation, and also, yes, we need to say how these things were made. And when I take people into the pavilion, I say, look, here's real bamboo and here's imitation. Why was it imitated? Couldn't George afford the real thing? Of course he could. But if you have a whole trellis, going around the room, if you have fitted cabinets, of course, get it done here to the exact specifications much quicker. Yeah. So I hope that sort of answers your questions. But there's also wonderfully interesting books written about what women could do, were allowed to do, what was acceptable to do, and a lot of it is very fiddly stuff. So making little things out of papier-mâché, and Shinrasari, of course, plays a huge role in this, and it goes also through the classes, of course. So you find it almost every level. But what I'm showing you here is court style. Make no mistake, this is court style. The princesses had the emperor's gifts in their rooms in Frogmore House.
What kind of evidence is there that the things that were made and adapted, that was George rather than, say, merely the Craces or Robert Jones's ideas?
Okay, really important question, and I wish George had told us why and how. But it's very clear from, and I hope I showed that by referring to Carlton House and what he saw as a little boy, and simply by seeing the Royal Pavilion and the lengths he went to create this. It was clearly his vision. He worked extremely closely with his interior decorators or interior designers, and that was a relatively new thing. That's that clear division of architect on the one hand for the exterior and the structure, and then designated artists, designers, decorators for the interior. So that's really interesting. And he's in touch with all of them, and he watches them, and he asks them to come down. So we don't have letters saying, I would like to have a Chinese room because, but what we do, so that doesn't exist, but we do have the records and what the Craces charge for George, yet again asking them to come down really quickly and discuss this and that to do with the Royal Pavilion. We know he came and watched or supervised or delegated the hanging of the Chinese export wallpaper, which of course is a whole different subject, and there's wonderful projects coming up at the Royal Pavilion on that. The entire upper floor was covered in Chinese export wallpaper, and he comes and watches the so-called India paper, as it appears in the records, being hung. He comes and looks over people's shoulders, we do know that, and we have a wonderful little sketchbook by the Craces, which was in my little exhibition, and it's 100 odd pages of tiny little drawings, lots of Chinese motifs, bits of columns, bits of dragons, and a later Crace has written in it, this book was frequently looked at by George. So I think he stood there, you know, Crace gave him the book, Frederick Crace gave him the book, said, what would you like? And he flicked through it and said, I want this dragon, I want this bat, I want this column, I want these colors. So we pieced this together. I think he was heavily involved. And this was his fun project. This was not it was not an informal place, but it was certainly less formal than the London court. And it was where he could go a little bit further with all his design ideas, with all his visions. Clearly, it's got George written all over it.
We've got quite a few questions about those beautiful Frogmore rooms that you showed us.
Oh, nice.
What happened to those, and do they still exist, or what form do they exist today?
Oh, I wish they still existed. Now, we have descriptions of these rooms in Pine's Royal Residences. This is a wonderful sort of 3-volume work, which you may find in good libraries, you know. I don't think it's been reprinted, but it's got 100 images of royal residences in the early 1800s. The pavilion isn't in it. Really interestingly, pavilion isn't in it, possibly because it was still undergoing complete refurbishment with Nash and all that, but also because this was very much George's thing and he wasn't king yet. So but that is a really good source. And of these 3 rooms, 2 are depicted in these wonderful aquatints. So we have the images, and they do not survive. Some rooms from that time, some interior, things do survive in Frogmore House, such as the wonderful floral decorations by Mary Moser, contemporary and friend of Angelica Kaufmann. The lacquer rooms don't survive, sadly, but I understand that a few of the panels, possibly the ones that are imitation, made by the princesses, do survive in a palace in Germany, and I can't tell you the name now, but one of the sisters married a prince, someone in Germany, and some of the panels are there. So maybe we'll put that in the follow-up email, but it's not the complete interior, sadly. It's not. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, I think that answers it. It's just kind of fascinating to trace the kind of journey so many of these objects and rooms have taken.
Yeah, and I hope I made that clear. I don't think it's all sad. You know, yes, of course, ideally, we'd love to have the complete 1820s interiors of the Royal Pavilion, but actually just showing you the movement of that one Weisweiler cabinet, I think that's fine. It starts somewhere else, it goes somewhere else, it gets copied, it moves again, it came back to us for 2 years. That was great too, you know. So why not? Why they're moving, they're literally moving interiors, and I think that is fine. That is fine. Yeah.
There were a couple of questions about entertaining, the entertaining that George did there. The aquatints you showed had, you know, a lot of guests kind of usually around the edges. And of course, the banqueting table is huge, and so are the kitchens. How many guests could he accommodate for things like meals? And where did people stay when they came? And then another person asked, was the pavilion open to the public as other country houses might have been, you know, for the housekeeper to take you around?
Okay, several questions here. So basically, when we sort of go backwards in time. So when the town commissioners bought the empty building and the estate from Queen Victoria in 1850, they made it, they opened it immediately, even in this state, and they used it, and they tried to recreate some of the interiors, and they struck up this good relationship, which we still have with the Royal Collection and of course Her Majesty. So they opened it pretty much immediately because it became a municipal place. Before then, that's really interesting because I'm currently looking into the earliest responses to and accounts of the pavilion descriptions. And it's really interesting. Of course, it wasn't like a museum, but certain people had access even when George was not there. For example, the German architect Schinkel. And this is really curious because how did he get in? And he gives us some descriptions of some aspects that I haven't found anywhere else. So there were ways of getting in, but it didn't operate like a museum. The best accounts we have, of course, about the entertainment, and this is well spotted, this is a place, this was always meant to be a place for entertainment, to entertain people. This is what I want to do with my Yale book. Describe the building as a place to be enjoyed and experienced, and how it affects your senses, really. And that was all completely deliberate. So George built this as a pleasure palace, as a party palace. It's relatively small. It's smaller than it looks. It's a picturesque building that pretends to be bigger than it is. But it actually, the two main rooms, the largest rooms, are the ones added by John Nash, the music room and the banqueting room. Until before they were added, the saloon was the largest room. So it's relatively small. But entirely designed for entertainment. So what happens in these two largest rooms? Eating and drinking and singing and dancing and music. So it is all about entertainment and the senses and welcoming people. So and being German, of course, quite often people say to me, oh, isn't it a bit like King Ludwig's of Bavaria's, fancy castles? Of course, they're later, but the big difference between the two is that George opened his pavilion. He wanted people there. He wanted to entertain. He wanted guests to be there, whereas, of course, King Ludwig of Bavaria didn't. He sort of roamed the empty halls of his palaces. They do look a little bit bigger than they were, especially the dining room. 36 people can sit at that dining table. And we base the interpretation and the presentation of the room on that aquatint. And we recently received from Her Majesty on permanent loan the original chairs. So you can just imagine the king himself sitting there with all his guests, and the seating arrangements were, as I say, not informal but less formal. And he introduced at the pavilion promiscuous seating, and this was seating not according to rank, so which allowed him to, of course, have his favored ladies, whatever rank they were, to the left and the right of him. So really interesting. And in the music room, there was a bit more room for maneuver in the music room because the music room is relatively empty. So there was a lot of room for dancing. And the only decorative objects were these towering pagodas, and it's quite a thought of a concert in there, or a ball with the king's band playing, and then, of course, all the dancing going on. So you could up it to about 100, I reckon. 150 in that room. Staying now, accommodation. This is interesting. This is Brighton. It was a thriving seaside resort, and we now have a population of about 250,000, I think. At the time, the palace was not quite in the center, but on the edge, so where everything was happening. He saw the rich and famous arriving in town and going to the lending libraries and the museums and so on. But it was never a big palace because of where it was and how it was created. He had trouble buying up bits and pieces of land. He had trouble closing off the road from London, which ran past his front door. And there is a chamber floor. So I've shown you today the staterooms of the ground floor. There were private apartments. There were, of course, the kitchens and other rooms. And there is a chamber floor, which continues in this theme. Even though they were rarely used, I mean, not rarely used, but people were not invited to stay unless you were a high court official or you were close families. So the dukes would stay, of course. You did not, if you had an invitation to the palace, you would, not necessarily be able to stay there. There were other buildings nearby which were used, but on the whole, the chamber floor, although hugely interesting, with the continuing bold Shinrasari theme, all the rooms are very small and quite low, and that's because of what John Nash did with his sort of minarets and the onion-shaped domes. But it is a true pleasure palace.
Mhm.
So we have a question about the conservation and care of these objects, which I am also very interested in. This audience member asks, all of the objects are so delicate. How do you keep them clean?
Well, of course, all the objects that came from the Royal Collection were in absolutely immaculate condition, because the Royal Collection just does it so extremely well. And you saw the wonderful David Wheeler, who's cleaned and restored and assembled all of the pagodas and many other objects, the uplighters, which we didn't have time to go into. So the Royal, but each institution does it slightly differently. The Chinese porcelain, yes, it is delicate, but it's also high quality. So I didn't have to handle the royal loans. That was done by professional art handlers and not by us. But of course, we handle our objects. And of course, you have to have a certain confidence. You have to do it properly and, follow certain rules. The curators work extremely closely with the conservation team, who are just fabulous. So some things are easier to clean than others. Anything you can move easily and handle is fine, and you just get the right people who know what they're doing. Porcelain on the whole is fine. It's quite easy to gild. Bronze, of course, needs to be clean and polished. Dusting is another aspect. Paper is a hugely complicated area, of course, and I'm working currently very closely with the paper conservator at the Royal Pavilion on the restoration of some Chinese wallpaper. Some got done during lockdown. So I know, Susan, you've just been there, and you may have seen the sort of Chinese wallpaper rehung in Queen Victoria's bedroom. Beautiful, and then filled in with digital, bits, digital printed bits. So paper, hugely difficult. But yeah, it's collaborative work. The most difficult things to clean are the huge chandeliers. And if you remember the banqueting room, that massive chandelier, which was returned by Queen Victoria because it didn't fit anywhere else. It's 9 meters long. That's a sort of a 2-story house. It weighs a ton and it doesn't move. There's no mechanism. It just hangs. Possibly the largest chandelier in this country. How do you clean this? You can't take it down. You can take down the crystals. So if we just clean the crystals, we build a scaffolding tower, we number them, we take them down, we clean them, we put them back up. If it's the whole of the chandelier, we have to build scaffolding that goes all the way up. And we've just cleaned the chandeliers of these wonderful, the ones in the music room. They look like sort of upturned umbrellas, floating lilies. Of course, you can imagine what falls into these: dead insects and dust. And again, towers, you have to go all the way up and go in. But yeah, it is hugely complex and difficult, and we are open all year round. We only close for 1 year in normal circumstances, in January, to do a lot of cleaning. Of course, that was another, apart from seeing you all here, a global audience. The other good thing about the pandemic was we were allowed to go in. Essential staff could go in, and the conservators worked so hard, making the best of lockdowns and cleaning. So individual people, social distancing, cleaning and cleaning and cleaning for all the lockdowns. Rather fabulous. I did it in my own little way. I also worked once a week in the archives doing what could be done in lockdown there. Yeah.
So he didn't seem to be thinking about how to clean these things that he was dreaming up, it sounds like.
Yeah, I don't think he cared. I think, given that a room like the Saloon, which starts in the 1780s, it's one of the first rooms of the building. So it starts as a neoclassical interior, and between 1787 and 1823, it goes through at least 4 design schemes. 4 times he changes his mind completely. And I think, had he lived longer, and also the last design scheme, which we have brought it back to this room, had silver leaf on the walls of stenciling. I'm not allowed to call it wallpaper, it's called wall decoration, but it's, it's silver leaf, 250,000 stencil motifs in silver leaf on the walls. Well, you know what happens to silver. It tarnishes. So it turned completely black within a couple of decades, and it would have done again with this restoration. So and I don't think George cared. He probably would have changed it again. He probably would have come up with another design scheme. And for us, it's more difficult because, we have to raise the funds to restore rooms like that. And can you do it in silver? Do you have to be true to the original, but knowing that in 10 years you have to clean, do it again? So we make decisions, we make curatorial decisions, and we try and be sensible. So in this instance, in the Saloon, we decided to go for platinum leaf. So platinum does not tarnish. The price was the same. So one of our wonderful conservators got a good deal on platinum leaf. It looks slightly different, and I make silver jewelry, so I have a pretty good eye for metals. So I thought, it's not silver, but you can adjust this by lighting, of course. And I think that's a really good, curatorial compromise to do something that will last, because, somebody has to pay for all of this.
Well, it also seems to be in the spirit of the thing, since he's imitating bamboo with iron and more substantial things. You're imitating silver with platinum. So,
indeed.
I have a question that came into my mind a couple of times. Why are those aqua tints so disappointing in terms of color? Is it something to do with how they were made? Or were the artists just not that interested in capturing the intensity of the color of the originals?
Well, very good point. Maybe I was a bit too harsh on Nash's views and the aqua tints. Now there are some of the best aqua tints you can find at that time. They are, of superior quality, and that's how the book was advertised, as being of the highest quality and best finish and so on. They are wonderful. They are extremely useful visual sources for us. We use them for almost everything we do. It comes down to the detail. So those pagodas, that's why it's so wonderful seeing the objects in real life and how they speak to the room. A tiny aqua tint. I mean, the aqua tints are so book size. And you can only do so much. And as an aqua tinter, or even the people hand coloring them, they would have had to see the real things in order to do them justice. And it was just one element in a very, very busy image. So, but we also have in the same book, which was commissioned by George, of course, published by John Nash, and most of the original drawings were produced by Augustus Charles Pugin, the elder Pugin. And when he made his drawings, so George came down and looked over his shoulder. And luckily, there's also outline drawings, so etching. So we have the architectural and the the details of the decoration, which is really important for us. If we're trying to recreate something that's missing, and we look at Pugin's drawings, they are hugely valuable, even if in the aqua tints the color is sometimes not quite quite accurate or enough. But luckily also some of the original watercolors survive. We have some in our collection. There's quite a few in the Royal collection. So we're piecing things together. And then, of course, we have hundreds and hundreds of surviving drawings by the Craces, both here in our collection and a wonderful body of Crace work is at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. So, and combined with the descriptions and the account books, we can piece together. And this is what we did for this exhibition. We were, you know, the team at the Royal Collection Trust and the team at the Royal Pavilion worked together, and we threw all our combined knowledge into one pot, and that made it possible for us to bring, really to recreate as close as possible anywhere in this country the Nash views, which are similar to the Pines Royal Residences, obviously. I mean, where else are you able to see this, you know, a near complete Regency interior? It was fantastic. Of course, they have gone back now. The loan period has finished, but there are still many, many objects that are original to the building, and we have, of course, the photographic records now of these loans in place.
Thank you so much. I wish we had time to go through all of these questions. I think we've had more questions for this talk than we've had in any previous talk in the series. So it is very unfortunate, but we do want to thank you again for coming to join us. And we want to thank the 100 and I think it was 55 people who came out today to hear you speak. Hold on, everyone, because we have a few announcements to make before we go, including future events. We have 2 more events in this series. On March 24th, we're going to be talking about Jane Austen and the British Way of Tea, which, like this talk, is going to talk about tea as an export item and the journey that it made, as well as the rituals surrounding tea. That's on March 24th. And then on 21st, we have award-winning writer Karen Tay Yamashita talking about her book, Sansei and Sensibility, which is a set of stories inspired by Jane Austen, as well as Karen's own experience growing up as a 3rd-generation Japanese American. A Q&A will follow both of these talks. As always, they are free, and you can get your Zoom link at janeaustenandco.org/sign up. And if you're interested in Jane Austen, her lives and afterlives, be sure to check out the Jane Austen Summer Program. We are an annual symposium based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This year's theme is Jane Austen and Shakespeare, taking place June 16th to 19th. There might still be a few spaces left on registration, so be sure to hurry and sign up. And I can say for our teachers out there, we do have teacher scholarships that are available. And you can find out more at janeaustensummer.org. Susan?
This program was supported by the North Carolina Humanities, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We would also like to thank the University of North Carolina's Humanities for the Public Good, which is a project of the College of Arts and Sciences with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Carolina Asia Center for their support of our program. Please consider making a gift to the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the umbrella organization here. We're a registered nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible in the United States. Donations help keep Jane Austen and Company events free and open to the public. And they allow us to bring in wonderful speakers like Alexandra Loske. They also go to supporting our other activities, such as our student essay contests and our annual teacher scholarships, which enable middle and high school teachers to win scholarships and attend the in-person conferences for free. And we're starting a new promotion. We are selling ampersand pendants and cufflinks. And in fact, I'm modeling one tonight. I don't know if you can see it, but there it is. To raise money for Jane Austen and Company. And these might be, well, Valentine's is late, but you could still make an impact, or birthday or graduation presents. And we're going to start taking orders on those next week. So thank you all once again for attending, and thank you, Alexandra, so much. This was so interesting. It was really wonderful.
Thank all of you for inviting me and for coming. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we'll see each other again. You know, if any of you come to Brighton, the Royal Pavilion, just give me a shout.
Thank you so much.